Hi, and welcome to RBP on JSB. I'm violinist Rachel Barton Pine, and today we're going to be discussing the third movement of Bach's Sonata No. 2 in A minor, the Andante in C major. By the way, if you want to hear a discussion about some of the general issues that pertain to all of the sonatas and partitas, please be sure to watch the overview episode. So this movement is clearly constructed with two distinct voices, a melody voice and an accompaniment voice. So you could think of it as the left hand and right hand of a keyboard, or perhaps as a violinist with a cellist playing along. And as always, when there are multiple voices, it's very important to practice each voice separately. So the cellist would be steady and even, but would not be square. So there would definitely be some phrasing. You can kind of think the melody voice in your head so that you can figure out how the cellist would shape their accompaniment to enhance the melody. Bringing out the note change. That's actually an important moment in measure 4 because you want to make sure that because the last note of the melody on the second eighth is the same note as the next note of the accompaniment on the third eighth, that they don't sound like they're two of the same G. Melody G, accompaniment G. Just so that they don't sort of blend together in a way that obscures which is the melody and which is the accompaniment. Now, the melody. What the heck do we do with this? So, for many, many years, people slurred it. It was both because of the eighth notes, somehow playing a slur of 2/16 felt good on top of a single eighth, you know, this kind of stuff. And even actually, it's been so long since I've done that, it feels a little weird, but that is still the way that many, many people play it. And I would urge you to consider not doing that, or at least experiment with not sort of locking onto that as your default setting. Because, first of all, the movement is entitled Andante. Andante is a walking tempo. This is not, you know, a slow, contemplative largo or something like that. This is actually a fairly active movement, and I don't think that Bach, you know, meant for you to do a whole bunch of slurs just because it's a melody. I think maybe he wanted you to kind of have a very, you know, very singing line, but yet still. And I think the argument against separate bows is, oh, it's too active, but then the question is, well, maybe it's supposed to be. And that gives the movement a whole different flavor, which is actually very, very nice, very pleasing. The other thing is, look at measure 3. It would, if you were singing it without the violin, you would not group it by two-note phraselets. You wouldn't go da 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 da. That just isn't musical. You go da 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 da. And actually, before I was brave enough to ditch the slurs altogether and go back to the manuscript, I actually re-slurred it to sort of follow a more natural approach to the phrasing. Because after all, if I was playing just the melody line without worrying about simultaneously playing the bass notes, and if I was going to be slurring, I thought, well, what slurs would I truly add? It's only the physicality of the bass notes that's making me do these two-note slurs, and that the physical reason for doing something is never as good a reason as a musical reason for doing something. So let's see. Because the da 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 da, that's one grouping. Da 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 da. That's the way the notes obviously go together. So then I thought, well, could I still do that with the bass notes? It's a little awkward. Of course, I haven't practiced it in a while. But at least it's shaped more nicely than... Because then instead of the bass notes accompanying the melody, instead the melody is sort of bound by those bass notes to go da 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 da. And so that's just not the greatest solution. But like I said, nowadays I just don't even worry about the slurs. Of course, the onus is still on the player to make sure that it doesn't become notey by doing separate bows. You wouldn't want... because then that doesn't sound beautiful at all. So you have to make sure that you still have ebb and flow and beautiful groups of notes joined together in little phrases. But that just feels good, sounds good. I would strongly recommend that you give those separate bows a try. Now, of course, you get to some spots later on, and there are other issues, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So basically, when you're doing the separate bows and you're doing just the melody line to feel the way that it feels when you're not worrying about the bass notes, then you realize that there are actually some fingerings that make more sense to use open strings than fourth fingers. Measure 7 is a great example of that. If I was just playing the melody, of course in beat 2 you would use an open string. Going to that F natural, you wouldn't go... That doesn't make any sense at all. But somehow, because in real life we have to play those low G's in beat 3, we end up using a fourth finger because then our bow is closer to the G string by staying on the A string. So what about, I know it's more awkward to go from E string to G string, but what about letting the melody line take precedence? So... because, yeah, the E is farther away from the G, but it's closer to the next melody note. And that's just prettier. For the last note, I would definitely hold both voices together, because if you had your cellist, who... times in slow Baroque movements with chords and stuff, it's very tasteful to roll the chord onto just the upper voice and finish with a single note. I often do this for the last note of the Largo in F major from Sonata No. 3, or the first movement of the Sonata in G minor. But in this particular case, because it's so clearly two voices, I feel like they both deserve to go all the way to the finish line, and so I do finish with a double stop every time. So there are some spots where the bowings become a little tricky. First of all, there is one spot, and one only, where Bach did put slurs on the 16th notes, and that, of course, is measure 16. So I used to think of that as an indication that that's the kind of thing he wanted you to do with the 16ths. He just put it in that particular spot as a clue, but you should apply it over the entire movement. But now I'm thinking, well, wouldn't he have, if he wanted to do it as, do this and then the rest is simile, wouldn't he have done that earlier than waiting all the way till measure 16? So now I'm thinking maybe that's a clue that everything really is separate, and except for the one place where he tells you that it's not. And maybe that means that measure 16 is something special. Interestingly, when I used to slur everything, I actually made measure 16 kind of loud and angsty because of that whole minor key thing, after... to slur. Gosh, I haven't in years. But yeah, so I would bring that measure out. But now that I'm doing everything separate and just that measure is slurred, I'm thinking, well, what could those slurs be? Because you have... and then if you had it separate, but the fact that it's slurred makes it a little bit more, you know, a little bit more sad and intimate, and you know, so I feel like that's actually a moment that it pulls back a little bit. So, you know, the second half starts innocently, G major, and then here, and then here, something very special. Etc. So anyway, I think you really can work with measure 16 and find meaning behind that one spot where he added the slurs, and it really does make for an interesting moment. Now let's look at measure 17. This is the first time when he's had a quarter note and 2/8 under it, but then instead of a rest before going on, like every other time, measure 1, measure 4, measure 5, etc., etc., instead he has a tie. He could have written a 16th note rest, but instead he has this tie, which is really interesting because it makes that note extra long and extra different, coming right out of the little slurs. Then this one connecting. Here's another spot where I use my open E. And now, oh goodness, by doing separate bows, we are now backwards with no chance to work it back out. So we've got to make up for it somewhere. So I used to just do an up-up right away, but somehow that showed too much. So now I keep these two guys separate and sort of sneak my up-up in right here. But I'm sure there are lots of other solutions. As long as you're back to a down by measure 19, you're fine. Now here's a little slur at the end of this phrase. So I used to add them to the next phrases, because you have, and then I went here, and then at the start of each subsequent phrase, but that does make the bowings get a little funky. So this one, I mean, you could argue that he's showing you that he wants all those next guys to be slurred also, but who knows, maybe he doesn't. Now here, I would keep it backwards, because then you end up on a down bow. Another up. Now here, if you do the bowing as written, you're on an up bow for a 4-note chord. Oh no. Actually, they're pretty comfortable with a Baroque bow, so it's not that big a deal. But of course, you could take an up bow after the first note. Or you could let this be a nice big slur. And then kind of tuck this in. Either way, you've got to do one or another compromise, and you can experiment and figure out an option that feels good to you. And then in the next bar, 26, which, by the way, has a mathematically incorrect rhythm in beat 2. So we've got a dotted eighth followed by 3 30-seconds, which doesn't add up. You've got like 1 30-second too much of music for that beat. So either Bach wanted the 30 seconds to be a triplet, but he just didn't write the little triplet symbol, or, you know, sometimes the mathematical notation was not exactly precise, but they all knew what they meant, and the dotted eighth might have in reality been a single eighth tied to 1 30-second, as opposed to the dot, which of course means it's tied to a 16th. So a single eighth tied to 1/32 followed by 3 more 32nds, which is actually how a certain Urtext edition, who shall remain nameless, prints it in their part. They correct it, but why they've chosen one correction versus another type of correction, and why they call themselves an Urtext but don't print the manuscript and leave it to the performer to decide. I think it's a little irresponsible editorially. Anyhow, what he really did right was this mathematically incorrect thing, and it's up to you to decide how to interpret it. I just kind of hold that note long and then just tuck in the 32nds. I'm almost not even counting it. As long as I come out to the next beat on time, it's all good. And then you have to decide, do you want to do separate bows there with a little hook? And then what about the Nachschlag? Or kind of tuck it in. So you have to decide about to slur or not to slur in beat 2, to slur or not to slur in beat 3. I actually do separate bows in beat 2, and then I do a slur in beat 3, but I have no good reason for doing that except that that's the way I happen to like it right now. Maybe I'll change my mind in a year or in 10 years, or maybe I'll like it that way the rest of my life. Don't know yet. Somehow just before the last note, I do like that slur, but I could definitely be convinced of that as well, and I could even be convinced to slur beat 2, because after all, you do have that held quarter note. So that would make sense. They'd all make sense. It's just a question of which version do you prefer. Now there are 3 spots in this movement that are what we call hemiolas. A hemiola is basically where you take a big 3 and superimpose it upon 2 smaller 3s. So the movement is in 3, meaning quarter note equals a beat. 1, 2, 3. And a hemiola would be 3 half notes. 1, 2, 3, right? So 1 and 2 and 3 and so there's the first example of that, which is a little bit less obvious, and maybe you don't even agree, but I like it to do it that way. That's starting on measure 6. Sometimes you can tell by the shape of the bass line whether it seems to be lending itself to a hemiola pattern. Even if you do choose to think of it as a hemiola, it almost isn't audible anyway, the way that the notes are shaped. So that's just more kind of for a fun idea. But the next 2, the cadential ones, are definitely very obvious and sort of inarguable, I would say. Measure 9, 1 and 2 and 3. And so it's actually the 1 and the 3, the big 3 being, of course, the actual beat 2 of the second measure. So 1. And there's a fun little ornament. So the real melody would be something bare like that, and here he's decorated it for you. So all those notes are not meaningful melody notes. They're just the frill on top of the underlying melodic line. Big beat 2. Tuck this in because it's not actually a beat anymore, and then this is your big beat 3. And I do add a slur to the whole rest of measure 11. I bet you could pull that off. It's all a question of what you like best. And then the other one, of course, is the end of the movement, starting in measure 25. So and And see in both cases the rhythmic pattern of the bass line. 1, 2, and 3. Using the beats of the hemiola. That's just such a typical hemiola rhythmic pattern that it's got to be a hemiola, because going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, not as satisfying. So 1, 2, and you can also tell by the harmonies, because here on your big beat 2, the chord is more intense. Here it's more plain, and here again it's unresolved. So those are some of my thoughts about the Andante in C major from Bach's Sonata No. 2. Thanks for watching RBP on JSB. I'm Rachel Barton Pine.